All right, wonderful. Well, let's begin. Welcome, everybody. Kia ora koutou. Welcome to this Thought Leadership webinar with the Wellington Regional Leadership Committee. My name is Frida Wells. I'm the Communications Engagement Advisor for the committee. And just a very brief introduction about the committee if you're less familiar with it. So the Wellington Regional Leadership Committee is a union of councils, iwi, and central government in the Wellington, Wairarapa, Horowhenua region. And we're formed to work together to positively shape the future of our region. And I'm a little bit excited about today's webinar because I think it's a topic that we are very much ready to lean into. So today's topic is navigating entangled opportunity spaces, how to manage complex work programs, with our speaker and subject matter expert, Daniel Hummerdal. So I am going to introduce Daniel and then he's going to speak for about half an hour and then we'll have time for Q&A. So I encourage you to throw questions into the chat. So today's speaker, Daniel Hummerdal. In his early career as a pilot, Daniel questioned the role and opportunity of humans in the system. An insatiable curiosity led him to retrain as a psychologist. And this unique combination of skills catapulted him into influential innovation roles across the globe, from Sweden to France, Australia, the UK, and finally here in New Zealand. He's dedicated to the holistic betterment of society, and Daniel's work is firmly anchored in the humanistic beliefs and that the potential for positive change wants to come through all of us. And so while Daniel has provided a very humble bio, I actually want to add to that for all the theory that he's going to be sharing today, he's actually one of a rare breed of people who has accomplished all of this in practice as well. So I just want you to keep that in mind as he's speaking. So his business partner kindly gave me a few more words. That he spent 15 years as an innovator, starting in the field of health and safety, which is actually one of the most compliance-heavy and unpopular subjects for putting people and purpose at the center of decision-making. He set up and ran the first innovation unit in a health and safety regulator in the world, creating change in a decentralized way by connecting with people's hopes and dreams for their work and for their organizations. So without further ado, I will pass over to Daniel.
Thank you, Frida, and thank you for the invite. What I can maybe add to that to give you a bit of a hint of my perspective where I'm coming from is that I was born and raised in Sweden, which is on the other side of the planet, but remarkably similar to New Zealand, and I really like it here. So I'm going to start talking about an experience I had 5 years ago. I was working with an airline in Australia, and their health and safety managers were really upset. We were sitting around a conference room table and talking about the reason why they were so upset, which was that they had been giving these incident reports about how aircraft mechanic had been photographed working in non-compliant ways with their working at height procedure. They've been hanging out cockpit windows doing maintenance tasks. They had not had stairs or nets in front of doors, and they were not using the harnesses when they were walking on wings and things like that. So they were talking about what can we do about this, and all their interventions were fairly, as it is about health and safety, very focused on controlling behaviors, throwing all kinds of lassos around their behavior. So they said we should have, poster campaigns of talking about how they can have, safety is our number one priority, or we should have a safety ceremony where people sign on, put their signature as a show of their commitment to health and safety. And my question to those managers was simply, so how have those things worked out in the past when you've tried them? How effective have they been to address this type of challenge? And the managers almost immediately, well, first of all, they went quiet and they turned to me and said, what do you suggest we do? What ideas do you have? And I said, I don't have any solutions for this. I don't know what would work and what wouldn't, but I know where to start. And that would be to go to site and talk to people to find out what matters to them. What is it that they want to achieve? What is it that they want to stay away from? And what is undermining their ability to work in the desired ways? So I went through a series of sort of approvals. I got permission to run focus groups on site, and under the condition that I brought up the working at height issue. Not in a single focus group did I have to bring up the working at height issue, because people brought it out spontaneously and they were so angry with the system, how they were undermined. Their professionalism was undermined by complexity and scarcity and things. There were other crews on site that more or less stole equipment from them, because there were competition between the base maintenance and the line maintenance. And there were so many issues going on. And I wrote down, well, I recorded the conversation and printed out each little experience, every story that they shared with me. A story is something that took place in terms of in either a specific time or a specific location. So I got 150 stories about it, and I printed them out on one A4 sheet per story, and I put them up on a wall in a meeting room. And I invited the health and safety managers, some people higher up the hierarchy, to come to this workplace and read the stories together with the people working there. So they were reading about what it was like to be there, but in sort of way that everyone could see what was going on. It was fairly unfiltered, even though it was anonymized. And people started talking, and they said, wow, they were sort of whispering away what was happening there. And then I gathered them around after half an hour, 45 minutes, and asked, okay, so what is it like to work here? Well, clearly we're very negative. We're very sort of pessimistic about what's happening here, but there's a goodwill happening, and people actually started to understand each other, and there was empathy growing between different parts of the system. So we kept exploring that. We kept defining the challenges in ways that everyone could agree on. So it was no longer head office defining what the problem was on site, or site telling head office how to get their stuff in order. And in the end, what they did was that they set up a site improvement team, or hangar improvement team is what they call it, in which 6 to 8 frontline workers were suggesting their ideas. Well, hundreds of ideas that came through. And a senior manager would then say, yes, go and do that, or yep, we can do that, but it'll take, let's wait 6 months when we have other changes coming, sort of coordinating that and giving money and time to go and do things. Within a couple of months, this went from a problem child to a center of excellence that they were sending their comms crews to do case studies on and so on. So to me, this is a story that illustrates that the power to change is much stronger when power is made by many, right? And when we try to do change to people, we end up with very sort of problematic notions. I think this is a sort of a good illustration, and a sort of a fun illustration. What happens in many workplaces that I worked with, how we simplify. We think that the problems that we're facing are relatively straightforward, or that we can actually think our way through them from behind a desk. But today we're going to talk about opening this door to step into complexity, step into the messiness, step into these entanglements that lead way outside our simplified graphs. And how can we do that in a way where we don't lose ourselves, where we still maintain a momentum and create energy for change without sort of dissipating and disappearing into the margins of this illustration, if you will. And maybe most importantly, where I want to end up is start talking about, well, how do we bring these other people with us who are so fascinated with this simplistic notion? Whatever approach we take to change, it should be informed by the type of issue we have in front of us. There are simple problems, or simple, where there's a straightforward cause and effect mechanism. If you're familiar with Dave Snowden, you know his categories around there. There are even complicated problems that can have technical solutions, and those are easy to define, and people accept the solutions quite readily. They say, oh yeah, okay, that would work, and people can actually see the logic of that type of change. But there are also those challenges that we're up against that are much more adaptive, as Gervais Bush calls them. it's difficult to agree what the problem is. Where does it come from? Who owns it? And we get subjected to lots of different perspectives to understand what that is about. And to get a change on that, it's not simply a technical solution, but it also requires a change in our values, our beliefs, our assumptions for how we should get organized or how we should lean into that space. But the really interesting things happen, well, it's not that interesting, but fascinating to some degree. If we approach an adaptive challenge as if it were a technical challenge, you say, hey, this is straightforward. You just need to adopt this thing that I've thought out for you. What happens then is that people push back. They get pissed off with you. They get they want to retain their autonomy to deal with this question because you're in their backyard, you're in their system to some degree. And we need to start thinking about getting their consent to do the changes that we want to do at the very least, but we can do so much more than just getting consent for it. Adaptive challenges also require changes in quite a few places. There is no silver bullet for those challenges. We need to think more of a silver buckshot, as people talk about this. A spray of interventions that will deliver change. And only when you have a network of that thrown across a system, you start getting progress or change. In this sort of adaptive challenges world, no one controls everything. There is no one stakeholder who holds all the levers or the strings to make things happen, but everyone influences something, right? No one controls anything or everything, right? But everyone influences something. And by getting everyone, or getting a representative sample of everyone at least, we stand a much better chance to both understand things, but also get a suitable change in the system. So today we're going to talk more about how to be in relation to adaptive challenges. I'm going to share my journey, some experience I've had, and even some mistakes that I've done, or what I find really challenging when I'm in that space. And I've organized today around these three notions. We're going to start talking about how we can sort of explore complexity or explore messiness or these entangled opportunities, and then moving to understanding them and then to collaborate. And already here you can see that I'm using categories that are slightly different to what I see being used with traditional or mainstream change approaches. There you would have a discovery phase. Right? So it's important to notice the notion of discovery. We go out and we discover the truth. We're still operating within that sort of paradigm of one truth, and that can be discovered if we're just, critical and smart enough. But here I'm saying explore is sort of an up and out. We go out and you just, explore the landscape and try to draw a picture of it, which can be drawn from many different peaks and valleys and perspectives. In the middle phase, what you have in the mainstream approach would be analysis, which again is, a scientific paradigm of using that sort of sitting back and finding the truth about what's going on. But understanding here is a much more psychological undertaking of trying to understand different points of views, different perspectives, different links and relationships within this messy sphere that we have. And then we're going to talk about how do we then get some alignment or synergies between different actors in the system. So if we just jump into that exploring part here, exploring messiness or stepping into messiness is quite challenging. I remember one of the first time I had to do it, I was working for a construction company over in Brisbane. And they sent me off to this construction site, more or less in central Queensland. And I arrived on site. I was more or less fresh off the boat from Sweden. And I've just started my first gig in health and safety, innovation. And I had a crisp orange PPE shirt, a shiny hard hat, and steel cap boots that had never touched the red soil of Queensland before. And I arrived on site, and this is sites in the middle of nowhere of 500 to 1,000 people might be living there in container-like sheds. and they all go and sit and have dinner in this massive diner. And I was faced with these extremely blokey Australian outback types. And then you had this skinny European guy in his shiny safety wear sitting there. And I just felt like I'm going to try to understand these people. I am going to try to ask them questions, get them to, get information to flow from them onto me. How do I do that? I didn't speak English that well back then, and I was quite fear struck in that first evening when I arrived. And the next morning, I ran my first focus groups, and I put a digital voice recorder on the table, and I open up by saying, "Well, hello, my name is Daniel. I'm from Sweden. I work in health and safety team of this company, and I work in the head office in Brisbane. And on top of that, I'm a psychologist. So this means that I know nothing about what goes on here inside. I'm here to learn. I'm here becoming very naive as to what your realities are. I'm just going to ask you a bunch of questions." And people started laughing. They thought it was funny, and they relaxed, and I was in. But regardless how you solve it, I just want to acknowledge that stepping into other people's realities is actually comes with a psychological threshold for us to get out from behind our desks and actually face situations that we don't understand initially, and we just have to sort of lean into that. To identify who you should talk to, I think a really good question that worked for me is, who cares about this question? If you're facing a system changed question about changing school lunches or infrastructure sectors, as was a recent challenge of ours, well, who cares about that? You need to talk about with clients, but also with contractors and their subcontractors. You might want to talk to business owners, but also workers, and you really need to sort of follow or map out who might care about this question. Well, if you're lucky enough to work on a small enough project, you can actually talk to everyone. But once you start getting into sort of 100 people plus, this becomes really challenging. 100 people is probably the most people I've spoken with in an exploration process. So think about how you can get a representative sample or the voice of people who work night shift and day shift and different occupations within a setting. And then you listen to what matters to them. You have things that matter to you, like working at height, for example. But when you start talking to people, they may not want to talk about that initially because they have other things on their agenda. So listen to, ask them to tell you about what is it like to, how does this system work for you? What is it like to work here? What is it like to operate or interact with it? And they will take you on a journey. And you will have people who will give you gold, and you will have people who you barely understand what they're talking about. And that's sort of, you get a distribution of qualities, I guess, in what people bring to you. But it's really important to listen to, what do they want to get away from? Where do they aspire to be? And I think this is really setting you up for the next stages. I listed here at the bottom thing on the slide, which is, when you leave this, you should be able to frame very succinctly a purpose for a change initiative that would motivate people to step towards you. And that is really difficult to do unless you've spoken with people. If you work in a government setting, that I assume that most of you guys do, you're probably in a relatively risk-averse setting, and the initiatives that run will probably be more around deficit fixing or sorting out things that are not working. But when you talk to people, sure, they care about that. They care about not dying or being seriously injured at work, but they also want to arrive on time. They want to have a nice experience while driving. They want to save fuel. There might be lots of things that are sitting in their worlds that are really motivating them. So your task sort of gradually becomes about finding the overlap, or finding that space that sits between people, and finding the language to describe what that is. As you're stepping into this space, I think it's really good to think about what, already when you're exploring here, you're starting the change process. You're stepping people into a change story. When people get the chance, or at least when they know that you're out there talking to them, they start setting their expectation that change is coming. So that in itself, of just listening to people, is an intervention to start preparing the ground for change. But it's also very different than traditional change initiatives that are more focused on creating a persuasion to people. But what you're doing here is you're trying to persuade yourself at the same time as you're bringing people with you about what change is necessary. The beauty of that is that you're also getting a lot of anti-stories. Why should I be telling you this story? Last time I told someone about this, nothing happened. That is maybe the most common obstacle that I'm up against when I run focus group. And you have to acknowledge that I believe, yeah, we have dropped the ball on a number of change initiatives in the past. You're absolutely right about that. This change initiative is slightly different, though, that we're not doing change to you in that sense. We want to, create something where we all start improving things together. You explain your way around the anti-story, and all of a sudden, people give you at least the benefit of doubt to sort of move forward there. So once you have your requisite sample of the complexity, if you're collecting stories or relationship or causal pathways, whatever way you have of mapping that out, you want to sort of bring some understanding to it, because it can be kind of messy, organic to just have lots of stories, for example. So it's impossible to understand complexity from just one point of view. You actually need multiple points of views to analyze them, to understand them, to fully embrace or reap the value of what is sitting in there. You will see some things because of your perspective, but you won't see it all. So you need to invite lots of people to do that. If you listen to the story that I shared initially, I invited 30, 40 stakeholders into a room to read these stories and make sense of it for them. But there are other ways of doing that. You can step people into that complexity by exposing it in drawings, in system mappings, and so on, and ask them to reflect back to you what they make of that. The benefit of doing this is, of course, that this helps you to just understand what you're up against, but it's also the beginning of forming a collective ambition. What do we do about this space? Because this space sits between us. And it's important to recognize that people will have some overlap with what you're going after, but not a complete overlap. There will also be gaps and discontinuities. But I would suggest that you really try to bring into focus what I try to illustrate with this little drawing here, that there is an overlap between lots of people. Sometimes it's not straightforward to find the overlap, but you actually need to think about what language you use to describe it. I was running an ideation workshop with some mine workers, and they were standing around talking about the challenge more than what to do about it. And they're talking about pre-start meetings. They had issues with people getting instruction during pre-start before starting their shift, and they would go out to site and they would go to ramps where there was no digger or there was no truck, and it was not working really well. And the supervisor said, well, it's because people not paying attention. They got a hard hats over their heads, over their eyes. They're not paying attention. And someone whispered to me, well, it's because the supervisor is kind of boring. He shouldn't be telling this story. And someone else said, well, we're sitting in this room and the air conditioning is so noisy, you can barely hear him. How can you pay attention for the 12 minutes? And someone else said, well, it's the format. You can't inform 70 people in 12 minutes. That's just, So you can see how different descriptions of the problem is actually, people favor different descriptions. In the end, what they came up with was something like, information is not being conveyed effectively at pre-start meetings. So, yeah, fine. Everyone's happy with that. And you didn't have this antagonistic thing. Just a small example. And the same thing goes for the purpose. It's important to recognize that people gravitate toward different purpose descriptions. I'm just thinking about an example, but I might sort of talk a little bit about this instead, or use this to illustrate my point, I should say. The outcomes that we're going after, you can go after a whole range of outcomes. Here is sort of moving from deficits to a thriving situation. And a recent project we were working on, we really focused on deaths and serious injuries. So that's okay. That's part of this continuum. But when you go out and you talk to people in the space of being truck drivers or taxi drivers or pizza delivery people, they are not talking about those things. That's not the first thing that comes out. They talk about other experience they want to have. They talk about how they want to feel at the end of the day when they've been out driving all day. They talk about the energy they have left to give to their families. So this is a real nice creative challenge to find some a language or a purpose or a question that people can agree is meaningful to go after. We were doing some work with infrastructure sector here in New Zealand a year ago or so, and we were talking to people about their experiences, and they were isolated and they were sick and tired of the master-slave relationship between clients and contractors, and they had issues with the cost-centric model of infrastructure rather than the value that you produce and such. So in the end, we came up with this question of how can we create a thriving infrastructure system in New Zealand? And we put it to the sector, and it has really, started this grassroots movement for that. It doesn't mean that we don't care about the deficits or what's not working, but it became a question, sort of an umbrella question under which we could fit even the things that we want to get away from. Now, moving into this sort of how do we create action? How do we start getting alignment? How do we create a collective movement towards something, a synergy between the different system owners or system stakeholders that we might have? As I mentioned before, no one controls anything, but everyone influences something. And you probably saw in the previous slide or the two slides ago that we want to bring people together from across a number of organizations to work on this collective ambition or the collective challenge that you have. And what I find quite meaningful here is for people to start talking about what do you want to create? What is the mission that you're going after? And I'm using mission here in the way that Mariana Mazzucato talks about it in mission economy. They're familiar with President Kennedy saying in the early 60s, before the end of the decade, we're going to put a man on the moon. Something that is, something you can visualize, something you want to achieve. And that's the outcome that you're going after. That's the ultimate situation you want to create. And then you think about, you really open that up. How can different groups, how would they like to contribute to it? Rather than telling people, you need to do this, rather than having that sort of top-down accountability mechanism of directing people to it, saying, hey, we all want to achieve this mission. How would you like to contribute? And there's all kinds of contribution that might come to you. Some people might want to run experiments and try new things. Other people might have ready-made interventions that were just sitting, waiting in a pipeline. It's okay, we're going to fast forward this thing. Other people say, I don't have much, but I can contribute with my network, with my experience and coaching. And all of a sudden, you have the beginning of what is, I think it's better to think about change as a social movement when you're on the right-hand side extreme of this slide, where people are working together towards achieving a common mission. Or a common purpose or ambition, if you so will. This has obvious benefits to it because you're getting that sort of network of interventions to address it, but it also has benefits in terms of the sustainability or partly the sustainability, but also the power that you get behind it is very different. If you go to the representative sample here, this is what I saw a lot of happening at a safety regulator that I'm quite intimately acquainted with, how you would sit in an office and design intervention onto an entire system because you care so much about health and safety. You think you have the right to impose these changes to the system onto all these more or less unwilling consumers. It gets a little bit better when you start inviting other people and create these sort of collective impact movements. But ultimately, what I'm talking about here is actually thinking in a much more open change. There you go. That's the company name for you. Kind of way around this, which is that people can step in and out of this as they see fit. And your role as a change maker in this space is much more about being an editor of change or a connector of change or a convener of change, if you will. Or I think coordinator is maybe a little bit too passive, but it's really holding the whole thing together creating that scaffolding and the infrastructure that a social movement needs, which is a very different role to thinking about you using incentives or disincentives to get people to move on. All this might sound a little bit airy-fairy or dreamy to you if you're looking at the organizational context that you're in. In all likelihood, the rest of the organizational context you're in might be set up in a top-down, hierarchical, command and control kind of way. So the question is, well, the issue with that is that it puts the change maker or the funder at the center of change. So the challenge is, how do we recenter the people that have the lived experience to be at the center of the change process? Because that's what I'm talking about here, how the change makers or the change stakeholders, the people who hold the money and so on, how they can still be part of it. This is not a laissez-faire or a sort of subversive method that I'm talking about here, but how do we decenter the people with money, or how do we create a change structure that gets stronger the more people that can contribute to it? In the moment, if you have a traditional structure, it's sort of the money and the power flows up and down to this person. We push information to the top and get decisions back. But here you want to have just looking at the fourth bullet point here, which is about pushing authority out to where community sits, or where the people, where the doers, where the makers of change are. Is one way of thinking about how can we free up, how can we take a step towards trusting that people will spend this money in a suitable kind of way. But in general here, I'm talking about putting the mission, the intention, and making it really shared. And we invest towards mission progress. I see a lot of investment which is either done towards the input towards change. Yes, we invested in discovery, invested in hiring these people. If it's a little bit better, we look at, well, we invest in buying the following changes in the system in terms of the output of the change, sort of putting it into the system, if you will. And rarely do we anchor the investment with the type of change that we have created, and that should be our commitment to it. And then you can have all kinds of milestones and progress that you can anchor that against. I'm really arguing here for that we should create a system. We can create a system which is driven more of a self-led accountability. Yes, I want to contribute to creating this type of New Zealand rather than a top-down accountability. It might sound a bit whimsical, but I also want this to be, I argue that you put your contribution forward and then you open up for feedback, so you get sort of at least a peer accountability, that other people are you're holding each other to accountable. But you said you were going to do this, but ultimately it is about being driven by lots of individuals or lots of individual organizations moving forward, or several. The bottom two here is really about creating that sort of infrastructure or scaffold for this change to occur. You need a collaborative space. This could be, I'm very encouraged when I hear about citizen assemblies, but there's also spaces you can do online where people can come together. There's innovation platforms where people can exchange ideas. There are entire movements that have been started on just exchanges in blog formats, and it takes off from there. It's really important that there's a place for people to come together. It can be in real life or online. Quite often, because of this new way of working, you need to invest a little bit in people's ability to learn and people's ability to try new things. How do you run trials? How do you run a micro experiment to test things out in a small scale where you are before you launch it in a sort of big kind of way? So I see we're running out of time here, so I'm just going to finalize things on this slide. Today, I've been very quickly argued for a different way of being relating to change, which is forcing us to open the door to this entangled mess that exists outside the office, outside the convenience of our siloed work program. To do so, we need to more or less abandon this notion that we might have that it's possible to understand the system perfectly in one powerful kind of way, one source of truth kind of way, and entertain that we can have multiple realities living in parallel. And we actually need to have them at least parallel for a while and collect them into the same room or make sense of them together. As we do so, we move away from just looking at what do we need to fix, what's wrong with this place, to actually inviting more people into a discussion about what kind of system do we want to create, what kind of future do we want to shape here. And the really interesting space for me is how do we move from an independent change being done to people to a collaborative approach to change? Of how do we create change together that we want to see? So yeah, over to you, Frida. That's what I had planned for this morning as a little intro to a way of embracing messiness.
Well, thank you. That is a lot to absorb, but it's a really powerful story. And I'm not sure how many people on the call are familiar with the concepts you've talked about. It's just really important and exciting to even have these conversations around this topic, to start to open the doors in our minds a little bit about how to confront change or situations that feel so complex we're not even sure where to begin. But there's actually a lot of wise people like Daniel who can guide us. So I want to encourage people to throw questions into the chat. Don't be shy. We've got another 20 minutes to this is where it can get quite interesting. I'm happy to throw one in to kick off. It might be a little bit dry. How do you get permission from the senior, SLT, or get permission from your organization to start working in this way? Or what arguments can you use to frame the benefits of working in this way?
Yeah. How do you push decision makers into messiness, if you will? The answer I could give is roughly what I told you in that story of challenging or calling out the overly linear solutions or that we jump to when we're faced difficulties, like I did with that airline, saying, "Well, tell me how well did these things work in the past?" and and then suggest a different approach to step. What if we tried something else here? And that is, it's not much more. You can do that in a lot of different ways, of course. And suggesting, what if we explored a different thing? What if we gave it to a bigger group of people to design the solution, right? And your role as a leader becomes about supporting people in doing that. And I think, I'm not the first one talking about this. I see this all over the world, and I think there's an appetite for it, but it's not so much should we do it, it's more of a hesitation about how do we do that. I've read about this. I'm keen for it. I understand that we want to have that type of motivation or unlock the potential of people to contribute, but who is going to hold that together and so on, and just raise your hand and say, well, I'll do it, can you trust me, this is what I need to do it. But it's a question of calling out when you see, oh no, we're heading down a way too linear technical approach to a really complex thing. Use that table that I have up there to call out, are you sure this is a technical problem? Are you sure? Let's actually question that to create a bit of doubt about whatever trajectory you're sitting in.
That's a really good answer. I think a lot of what you've talked about is it touches on the psychological thresholds that you mentioned around, this is about tapping into our own courage, and just using this language, I think, resonates with people because they do have their doubts and their fears. So it's nearly encouraging people on this call to just use the language. So there are some great questions coming in. So maybe I will just read out a few. Kate has asked, how do we overcome the issue of loss aversion, where the narrative about a perfect version of the past is more compelling than an unknown version of the future?
Yeah. I mean, that is pretty much the world of health and safety right there. Because health and safety is just about loss aversion to some degree. It's about preventing deaths and serious injuries and so on. What I have found quite successful is to call out the problematic side effect of a focus that is too limiting to focus on just what you want to get away from. It is locking you into a reactive approach to whatever it is that you have. And the world is moving on much quicker than that anyway. So you're always going to be reactive. You're moving into the future by looking in the rear view mirror. That's a good argument that I use a lot of time. It's become overly negative. People get zapped of energy if you only talk about what you want to get away from, all the problems and how we should constrain the system even further. When you start talking about creative opportunities, it unlocks energy and motivations in a very different way. if you have a lot of deficits, a lot of loss, this can be a very strong motivator. But as you approach zero or have very few things, or actually improve the system, the motivation for change goes out. It peters out the better you are in that space. So it's ultimately an unsustainable approach to change unless you just keep having more and more loss. And there might be something to be said about the benefit of going after loss if you have a lot of it. But once you get to zero, you have very little motivation to invest for change. And there are other issues with that. So my point is, call out the unsustainability of a deficit approach and suggest, with that. And actually, when you take a thriving approach of focusing on the value add that you can create, you can say, does a thriving approach to infrastructure, which was the case that we had recently, can you actually have a thriving infrastructure system in which people die? And people say, no, that it's incompatible. So when people start recognizing actually a thriving system means that we don't have the deficits as well. It's more ambitious, and that might be too ambitious for some people, but it actually doesn't mean that we are accepting loss. It means that we're including it in a bigger package as a sort of an outcome of going after what we want to create, long-termism, partnership, learning. When you go after those things, they will be better for those bad things you're trying to address as well. So they're not mutually exclusive as people might think.
There's an excellent answer, and there's lots more questions, so I'm just going to keep sharing them. Could you please talk a little more about sitting with the discomfort at the beginning of gazing into the messiness? That's from Amber.
Yeah, thank you, Amber. How can you, there it is. Discomfort, yes. The discomfort is, what is the discomfort? The discomfort is about not knowing, stepping into the unknown, stepping into a situation in which we don't understand, in which we feel as we are out of control. There's a real psychological discomfort is a mismatch between you and the situation you're in, or what your assumptions about the situation you're going to walk into. And the solution is about making the plunge or stepping into it, or start small if you're really that scared. Don't jump into having 10 focus groups lined up with blokey construction types in the outback. That might be too much. It's sort of, I survived, obviously, but start small and sort of step into it. So there's a little bit of that, recognizing that you have this aversion in yourself. The second thing is to trust the process, that you will be able to make sense of it after the fact. Okay, you will not know what kind of mess you're up against, but you're going to make sense of it once you've collected it. You need to collect it first. But yeah, that's it's a good question. It's a real thing. You're only going to get better at it the more you do it. Okay.
Excellent answer. I'm going to jump around a bit because there's a great question here, but I think at the moment we've got time for everything here. Carolyn asks, how do you generate the long-term buy-in needed to create systemic change when often leaders want quick results?
Yeah. No, this is, I think you need to do the same journey with the leaders that you're going to do yourself, right? What I mean by that, you need to step the leaders or the funders, whoever it is that you need to convince about what you want to do. You need to step them into the complexity. They don't have the time to go out and run focus group and collect it in the way you do. But for example, just look up system maps, for example. If you Google that, you will see that they bring up these beautiful causal maps of the intricacies and the messiness of a system. And you put that in front of decision makers and say, right, here is the system. This is how it's working. This is the interdependencies we're dealing with. Tell me which of these will give you the bang for the buck. If you just change it here, the system is still configured to deliver the outcomes that we currently have here. So you need to sort of prevent that. Well, not prevent that, you can't do that, but you need to cater for that knee-jerk reaction and say, invite them in to say, wow, okay, this is big. Actually, I'm glad you're saving me money by, not wasting it on these things. And open up their minds. And I really like working with stories and getting them to realize what is sitting in that space. So that invites them to start creating that sort of shared ambition with you. That being said, there may be some tiny, low-hanging fruit that is small that you say, we can do these things. And it's really good if you have figured that out, that there are some technical problems we can understand, but it's not going to generate a system change. So there's a challenge there. What kind of leader do you want to be for this? Do you want to deliver these technical solutions for these things, or do you want to go after something bigger? System change is going to be is going to take time, and it's going to be iterative. We need to make room for trying things and hitting dead ends, and try again in a different kind of way. So if you can throw them a bone every now and then, they're probably quite grateful, but keep the fire going for the bigger thing that you're going after, as well.
Thank you. I'm just going to keep jumping through these to see how many we can get through, because people are clearly really engaged. And so Kate asks, given the need for a compelling mission that is framed in language that speaks to all actors, how to do that when people are coming from diverse perspectives and use different types of language, e.g. with the issue of youth unemployment, the core issue is economic security, but no young person will describe it like that.
Yeah. No, it's not so much wordsmithing, but it's quite an iterative process in identifying a description that people can agree with. And trust me, if you get it wrong, they will let you know. It's as simple as that in sort of testing it out with a few people. I remember I did a thing, was also a mine site. I was in a workshop, and I described, people were saying the plans are incorrect for the work that we're doing. And I had 3 planners coming up to me after the session, and they were the guys, giving the plans to the mechanics to sort out. And they were so angry with me for essentially having discredited their entire work that they were doing. So I had to invest a lot in that relationship to get them to actually invest in this new future. I'm very careful with how I describe things, and I want to test this out. Or if I put it up, I'm saying, this is my tentative suggestion for it. Please give me some feedback if this works for you, if it doesn't work for you, and we can keep working on it, because it is important. So I don't have a formula apart from testing things out and sitting with this messiness or the unknown. I do find that something emerges in that space. You have to trust your creative genius to give you something in that space, and see what that is. There's listen to people, use parts of their language, but don't sell out to one party alone. That's the best I can give at this stage.
That's a great answer. And I feel like what I'm hearing in your responses is that you really give a lot of priority and value to the quality of the relationship. So there's a power dynamic which is very respectful. You're really giving people power
Yep.
in the process, recognizing that if they sense that and they're receiving that, the process will live, because it's not one that's disempowered them and command controlled, sort of being a humble, like a servant leader thing.
Yep.
Yeah. So another question here from Michael Roth. How do you deal with conflict or different worldviews, e.g. ute drivers versus cyclists trying to design a better transport system?
That sounds very applied.
Yeah.
No, I think it's a different version of the previous question to some degree. So they might hate each other if you put them both in the same room. The pesky cyclists. Whenever I go in taxi and Uber, I discover the intense hatred for cyclists in this town, and I feel so troubled by it, because I'm a cyclist myself. Anyway, so again, I think we need to start thinking about, okay, so the system is not working for ute drivers, and it's not working for cyclists either, right? So we can talk about people's behaviors in that sense, but that actually people's behavior is configured by the wider system, which means that we need to start talking about road design. We need to talk about where that is. How is the system configuring this conflict between you? Because it's a wider question here, and sort of lift the conflict, or go in to talk about design, and ultimately maybe go in to talk about the assumptions or beliefs that inform the way we do design. Why is it that we have designed roads for cars for such a long time? And what would a road design system look like that is really set up to design for people rather than a particular type of vehicle? And actually, it's about asking questions and, well, acknowledging that this is difficult, that their worldviews are perfectly legit, but it's coming from somewhere. It's anchored in the system, it's anchored in the design, and we can start making inquiries into that bigger configuration. And in all likelihood, you're going to find solutions sitting in that space rather than, creating truce between people. It's too ambitious. It's too complicated. I can't do that. And I can. So hey, what if? That's
Mm. That's so powerful because it sort of depersonalizes these sort of emotional responses people are having and lifts up that shared lens to the system. I think that's a powerful mechanism to use that system language. All right, I really want to get through these questions. So Kate, this is just a comment from Kate. Thank you, Daniel. I was thinking of this particularly from a political perspective, where the nostalgic narrative of Trump and Brexit and stop co-governance appears to be so much more compelling than the current future narratives. Okay, so she's referring to the past question. Yeah.
So such an astute comment. Makes me a little bit sad somehow to see that, that's the. I think when we're up against, when we're in difficult situations, we look for, simple solutions. Quite, we are attracted to strong leaders in those situations. Please deliver us from this evil that we're up against, and we hand it over to them. But it also seemed to go hand in hand with this longing for simpler times. In the 1960s, it was all so good because we didn't have immigrants, we didn't have these issues, and whatever it is. So no, thank you. I think that's a real. How do we move forward? How do we embrace the future? Where does courage for creating new come from? What an important question, huh?
Yeah, it's the time of the psychologists, as we say. So Spencer Club asks, how important, or perhaps does it change the approach if you have a tangible goal that you need to achieve? For example, a measured reduction in pollution to a certain level.
I don't think it changes it. I think it creates, if anything, it creates a clearer goal of where you're heading toward. So if you have a clear goal, you probably need to make that part of your purpose and how you invite people as well. It might have influences for how you frame your challenge as such. Otherwise, my experience is that being quite tangible about what kind of future you want to create, if it's deficits or the positives, is actually quite helpful. The more specific you can be about the sort of the bullseye that you're going after, people gravitate, or it makes communication easier. I'm not sure if I answered the question, but sometimes you can only work on the direction or the change in direction you want to create, but sometimes you can set more specific destinations on that new trajectory that you create. If you can, it's a good thing.
Thank you. And I think we might have time for one more from Carolyn. She says, I've taken the approach you suggest, but it still hits issues with leaders who don't value deep strategic thinking in models. I wonder how we can change the way we communicate collective and collaborative impact to describe the process and simplify the language to make it work for those in power who are action, cause, and effect thinkers.
Yeah, no, I think you're. I think this is the. This is clearly the business that we're in with OpenChange, and I recognize that it's sitting slightly outside business as usual. It is far from mainstream. You will find some informed leaders that want to do this, but I think it's wise to recognize that it's actually sitting in business as almost possible in that type of space. So the question is then, how do we both challenge leaders to start giving up on overly linear cause and effect models and step into this space? How do we invite them? But I do think that if you think about what is it that leaders need, what is it that they are afraid of, what is it that it would require them to do? And I think it's really important that we give them a clear role to play there. If you tell the story about Kennedy, setting ambitious goals, being a strong leader, and we actually need that leader. Can you be that leader for us? And we're going after that. I think that's going to talk to a leader's ego, if nothing else. It's going to reflect really, really well on you of being the sponsor of this change, of leading, the forefront of it, and then you can manage egos through that process. I do think there is something to be said about de-risking it, because people might feel like they're losing control, a bit like when you're stepping into complexity and collaboration, that, well, I'm not in control anymore. what is the control that leaders have there? This is not a laissez-faire approach. You still have control over how you can try to tilt the economic playing field for people by the resources you provide, by the platforms, how you communicate things. There's a bunch of things. It doesn't mean a complete giving up of control, but you actually need to show how leaders can be in control or what their spheres of influence is in that space. So role and new control leaders would be the things that I would go try to suss out. What can I give to leaders to be more comfortable in stepping outside that, and keep making them uncomfortable in the space where they currently are.
Nice. Those are really powerful answers. Well, we have no more questions in the chat. Lots of messages saying thank you very much. That was very valuable and useful. So I guess, are there any last comments that you want to close on? I mean, I could throw my sort of favorite question at you to end off. What is, I don't know, what are the most critical changes that we must make to face the future effectively with all this information that you've presented?
Yeah. Well, I can only talk about what I want to do in that space, which is, I think when you look at the change methods available out there, you can go to so many change management training courses, but none of them are really set up for this type of change. You can't really buy that off the shelf. And I do think I want to see that we can create the whole structure or scaffold that would allow an organization to sort of step into this space, not just for change makers like, I assume us in this webinar, but take the wider ecosystem with us and make, that's how it's going to play out. We can talk about it and we're getting better at it, but I do look forward to seeing that we have much more bigger tools and portfolios that we can bring, so we can take entire organizations and system with us more readily.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I think we'll sign off there. We've hit time, and we've just got a final message from Kate just saying thank you so much. For me, developing more compelling missions and future narratives is critical, and you've helped me understand that more clearly. So yes, I think these conversations are so valuable to keep having, and just a huge thank you for sharing your wisdom today. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day, and the recording will be sent out. Ka kite.
Bye-bye.